I was reading a famous Japanese short story recently, the kind almost every student there encounters in a classroom. And it paints this really specific, visceral scene. There's a young girl, Mayumi, and she suddenly feels this strange sensation deep inside her chest. It's not pain, and it's not exactly joy. She describes it as a red berry bursting, a sudden, messy, vivid splash that changes the color of the entire world around her in a split second.
Right.
In English, we'd probably look at that, we'd shrug and call it a crush or just falling in love.
Yeah.
We tend to lump everything from a first date to a 50-year marriage under this single massive umbrella of the word love.
It's a catch-all term for us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But looking at this story, you realize that for the Japanese, that specific trembling vibration, it isn't love at all. It's something entirely distinct called koi.
And that is where the linguistic psychology gets so fascinating.
It really is. While we view love as a progression, the Japanese view koi almost like a separate biological event from AI, or what we call true love. If AI is the warm safety of oxytocin, koi is the dangerous rush of adrenaline. It's described not as a choice, but as this repetitive, involuntary state. The kanji even translates to the heart moving again. It just raises this compelling question. By having only one word for love, are we missing out on understanding the beautiful, selfish, and chaotic madness that comes before the calm?
That is a fundamental question. It really cuts right to the core of all the cross-cultural research on emotion. And we can say pretty confidently that love is universally experienced. It's a fundamental human emotion. You see it across all cultures, all major historical eras.
So everyone feels it.
Everyone feels it. But, and this is the crucial part, the true complexity, the genuine nuance, is entirely dictated by culture. Culture is the lens. It's the lens that determines how that emotion is conceived, how it's categorized, how it's expressed, and very importantly, how society tries to legislate it through rules, rituals, and sometimes through language itself.
So when a language like English offers one enormous word, we're basically forcing this massive emotional spectrum into what we see as a single linear progression.
Yes.
Like crush, dating, partnership, love. It's a straight line.
It's a straight line, exactly. But when a language breaks it down, like Japanese does with koi and ai, it gives you distinct categories for those sensations, the chaotic, the involuntary, the selfish, and that's koi, versus the steady, the deliberate, the duty-bound, and that's ai. We call this the dimensional approach.
Okay, the dimensional approach.
We're basically examining the many psychological components of the human experience, passion, desire, commitment, duty, that various languages break down into these separate semantic fields. Fields that English often just merges into one large and frankly often confusing category. For you, the listener, understanding these distinctions offers a profound shortcut to understanding the psychology of attraction across different cultural blueprints.
Let's unpack this, starting with the Japanese experience then. Because that historical linguistic shift that happened after the Meiji Restoration, it feels like the perfect case study. It shows how political and social ambition can fundamentally redefine an intimate feeling. The cultural meaning of love had to be, imported and violently shoehorned into the Japanese lexicon.
It was a conscious, dramatic break, absolutely. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan was aggressively modernizing. The goal was to attain compatibility with the West, and this meant introducing Western concepts into public life.
And love was one of them.
A big one. The English concept of love, or rabu, was brought in primarily by Christian theologians and literary scholars. They saw it as the cornerstone of Western-style nuclear family morality.
And the key decision was how to translate this new, very spiritualized Western idea of romantic love. They eventually settled on ai, the character for A.
And that translation was pivotal. It changed everything. AI was posited as a new spiritual relationship that explicitly excluded physical union. It stood in opposition to the older concepts that had previously governed affective relationships in Japan.
Which immediately had a cascading effect, right? It must have changed the cultural value of the existing Japanese words for desire and affection.
Instantly. Take the word arrow. It originally meant color or hue, but it also symbolized beauty, poetics, and critically, it often included sexual consummation.
So it was a holistic concept.
Precisely. Airo was holistic. It included the physical as part of the beauty, part of the art of the relationship. But in this new post-Meiji landscape, Airo steadily depreciated in value. Io became the pure, noble, sanctioned sentiment. It got associated with spiritual and monogamous marriage. Meanwhile, ire was pushed down, demoted. It became the denominator of unspiritual base desire. Eventually, it came to refer almost exclusively to the activities of sex workers and illicit affairs.
So modernization, in its quest for this Western Christian-influenced ideal, created the systematic separation. Pure spiritual love, AI, was split off from physical desire, ire. And also from that initial chaotic, passionate feeling, koi.
Yes. The modernization effort didn't just introduce a word, it actively legislated an emotional hierarchy. Koi, that involuntary tremor of passion we started with, was explicitly excluded from the new spiritual concept of I. And this framework, by the way, became incredibly fertile ground for Japanese media and advertising.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Because if AI is stable and duty-bound, it's not. It's not exciting.
Not exciting. Koi is where the action is.
Oh, so the narratives we see, the films, the marketing, the tension and the excitement, the internal conflict, it's always centered on the crave phase. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and therefore it's ripe for drama. And crucially, it's ripe for the consumption of products designed to either soothe or enhance that excitement.
That's a key sociological insight, exactly. AI, the stable long-term marriage, simply doesn't sell as many cosmetics or romantic getaway packages.
Right.
The emotional script that emerged from this linguistic split really shaped expectations. If a young Japanese person's romantic development is guided by this idea that koi must be transcended, that it must be controlled to achieve AI, then the media is often selling the tools and the narratives you need to navigate that koi phase. The pursuit, the anxiety, the self-expression, that's a much more emotionally volatile and commercially viable phase than commitment.
This codified separation also explains so much about the sociological implications for a long-term partnership. If you enter a marriage based on deliberate choice, stability, duty, and you strip out the physical and chaotic aspects of koi, you end up with a very specific and maybe emotionally restrictive marital blueprint.
We will definitely return to how that played out in the modern Japanese marriage later. It's a huge topic. But first, we need to establish that this linguistic complexity, it is not a Japanese anomaly. If we step back and look globally, we see that segmenting the concept of love is actually the global norm, not the exception. Cultures all around the world feel the need to linguistically distinguish between different types of affection, intimacy, or desire.
Okay, let's connect this to the Spanish experience. Most English speakers, I think, you can say te quiero or te amo, but the transition between them is far more structured than just choosing between I like you and I love you.
It's much more structured. In Spanish, the progression usually runs through 3 distinct phases that track increasing intensity and context. First, you have me gustas, I like you. Second, te quiero, which literally translates to I want you, but it's commonly used as a softer, general expression of love or affection, maybe closer to lluvia in some contexts. And finally, you have te amo, the strong, intimate I love you.
Okay, but we know that the literal translation of te quiero, I want you, it doesn't carry that intense, almost aggressive or purely lustful connotation that I want you does in English. So why is that? What cultural weight removes the possessive nature from the phrase?
Well, the term te quiero is historically and culturally much more elastic. You can use it for family members, for close friends, and for romantic partners. It expresses a generalized, tender affection, perhaps closer to I hold you dear. The context is absolutely critical. It implies a sense of valuing the person, a kind of foundational affection, rather than a demanding, singular sexual desire.
And what's truly revealing is how te amo, the term most equivalent to the English singular I love you, is often sidelined.
It is. It's used far more rarely in daily life, precisely because it is so loaded. One source suggested it's primarily reserved for the most extremely romantic, formalized moments. Things like a proposal, a powerful letter, or quite humorously for dramatic contexts like telenovelas and boleros.
So the cultural subtext is that the most intense English equivalent term for love is often sidelined for being too dramatic, maybe even too unrealistic for the quiet stability of everyday connection. That suggests that Spanish speakers are constantly negotiating between high passion and stable companionate affection, just like the Japanese.
It's an identical negotiation, just using different linguistic tools. And we see this tension amplified even further in Brazilian Portuguese, which distinctly separates paixão from amor.
Right, paixão is passion.
Paixão is passion, infatuation, tumultuous sexual attraction, the volatile, chaotic end of the spectrum. Amor is the stable, companionate, duty-bound love, the secure, predictable end.
The confusion between those two terms in Brazil, especially regarding gender dynamics and fidelity, is fascinating. It's where the language itself becomes a tool for social maneuvering.
Oh, it's deeply eliminating, especially of the patriarchal structures that are still operating in certain contexts. In some traditional male circles, men find it challenging or, confusing to fully distinguish between paixão and amor. And crucially, some married men explicitly rely on this linguistic distinction to justify infidelity.
How? How does that work? Do they create a linguistic shield for themselves?
Exactly. A shield is the perfect word. They'll claim what they feel for the other woman is paixão, a momentary, uncontrollable rush of passion. And by their definition, that doesn't threaten the marriage, because what they feel for their wife is amor, which is the stable, foundational love.
So society is creating a linguistic loophole for men to excuse the instability of desire. But how does that affect the women who rely on amor being defined as strictly monogamous and enduring?
Well, women tend to view amor as encompassing both enduring commitment and sexual fidelity. They often see this male reliance on paixão as an excuse, or even as an inability to experience true, whole love that integrates passion and commitment. And this conflict, by the way, is exactly what's fueling the modern evolution of the concept.
You're talking about the amor-paixão conflation.
Yes. The societal pushback from women and shifting expectations within modern partnerships are driving this desire to integrate sexual passion back into marital love. It's an attempt to redefine the AI of marriage, if you will, to include a controlled, sanctioned dose of koi or paixão.
Okay, now let's move to the starkest contrast, which I think really highlights the societal stakes when two types of love become fundamentally opposed concepts of existence. And that's in Bedouin culture. This isn't just about intensity, this is about safety versus danger.
That's the key philosophical divide. We find two critical concepts here, ilhab and ralia. Ralia means precious, dear, or valuable. It is the emotion you feel towards your family, your spouse, your friends. It is profoundly embedded in the routine, the duties, the rituals, and the safety of the social network.
It's the core bond of survival. It connects those who are present and who ensure security, food, shelter, kin ties.
Absolutely. It is the secure base, the ultimate companionate love. Ilhab, on the other hand, is defined as a sickness, a death-defying condition. It's passion, desire, pursuit, and it is predicated on absence and distance. It breaks the established order, and it subverts kin ties to form attachments outside the social structure.
So it's the disruptive force, the dangerous desire for that which one does not possess or is not socially sanctioned to possess.
This opposition is captured in powerful Bedouin poetry, often about the conflict between these two forces. There is a story of a young man standing on a mountaintop, watching his family go one way and his lover go the other.
What does the poetry tell him to do?
He sings, "My eye flies east and my heart to the west." The sentiments of ralia, of duty, affection, and deep blood ties, the things he must see and uphold, fly with his eyes to his family. But ilhab, the longing and passion, carries his heart away with his lover, towards the danger and the unknown.
Wow. That just makes the English concept of a single love word seem truly insufficient, because we use it to describe the safety of ralia and the chaos of ilhab simultaneously, even though culturally they are diametrically opposed forces that threaten the very fabric of society.
And that takes us directly into how various cultures have historically grappled with the disruptive nature of passion itself. In this next section, we see how frequently intense, passionate love is seen not as aspirational, but as inherently painful, debilitating, or even a form of madness. It's truly an affliction.
That concept of love as an affliction, as chaotic madness, is something that goes back centuries and echoes so clearly in that Japanese idea of koi as an involuntary tremor.
It is a profound, global, cross-cultural motif. You can consider ancient Indian medieval love, where erotic desire was explicitly viewed as a sickness. It was often said to be inflicted by the mischievous god of love, Kamadeva. The initial affliction wasn't romanticized at all. It was viewed as a tangible psychological and physical threat that could compromise one's capacity to function in society.
What were the actual reported symptoms of this affliction? I want to know the clinical description of lovesickness in medieval India.
They followed a specific agonizing progression, almost like a medical chart. It would begin innocently enough, with an enhancement of the eyes, then fixation of the mind, and a strong will for union. But it quickly deteriorated into much harsher physical and mental symptoms. Loss of sleep, emaciation, turning away from all other sense objects, leading to listlessness, shamelessness, full-blown madness, and eventually collapse or even death.
That description, the overvalued ideas, the preoccupation, the loss of sleep, and emaciation, it sounds remarkably close to a textbook description of obsessive-compulsive disorder mixed with physical decline. If those symptoms sounded like clinical anxiety and neurosis centuries ago, what does that tell us about the biological reality of that initial coy phase?
It tells us that the passionate initial phase of love is chemically and biologically destabilizing across all cultures. There's modern research demonstrating biochemical similarities between the early stage of romantic love and neuroticism, or obsessive-compulsive disorders. It's driven by high levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, the adrenaline rush. The ancient Indians simply codified this destabilization into a social pathology. It was a giddy, yet potentially destabilizing, affliction.
And this fear of passionate disruption clearly carried over into the West, although through a slightly different philosophical lens. In medieval Europe, passion was also routinely portrayed as a dangerous, consuming force.
Indeed. During the 16th and 17th centuries, love was frequently described by physicians and scholars as a strong illness impossible to resist, often leading to what they called amorous melancholy. Descriptions spoke of corrupted imagination and consuming fire, with the passion beginning with a perception that setteth concupiscence on fire. This historical view required control and restraint. Passion was a threat to rationality and the social order.
And the ultimate expression of this danger, where passionate love becomes literally life-threatening, is seen in places like Indus-Khoistan and northern Pakistan.
In this high mountainous region, romantic love is genuinely dangerous due to the fierce requirements of family honor and patrilineal reputation. Ilhab, or passion, is literally viewed as a sickness, a death-defying condition. If a woman's brother or father discovered a nightly love meeting, they would make every effort to kill both lovers on the spot to reestablish the family's blemished honor. The stakes could not be higher.
But there is a particular anecdote from Indus-Khoistan that flips the script on what constitutes true love. It suggests that even where passion is deadly, it has to be elevated above mere desire to be valued.
It is an extraordinary story. It illustrates how the purest, most dangerous passion must be subordinated to a higher emotional category. A spy is dispatched to observe two lovers meeting on a roof to determine if their meeting is about dirty things, meaning sex, or true love.
And what did the spy observe?
The couple spends the entire night just looking into each other's faces. Their hands were dry after washing. The meal they had prepared was burning unnoticed on the fire. They didn't move at all. They just gazed.
Wait, they spent the entire night watching the meal burn, just looking at each other. That suggests an almost impossible level of ascetic discipline. What were they proving by avoiding physical touch?
The spy concluded, now he knows that it is a case of true love. Their intense self-control, driven by profound emotional preoccupation, proved the purity of their love. The underlying cultural ideal is that sex would make love smaller. The purest, most death-defying love must be spiritualized and non-consummated, even if it arises from intense, forbidden passion.
That dramatically contrasts with the traditional Western idea of true love, culminating in sexual union as a natural, healthy expression of intimacy. This brings us to the fundamental philosophical division between traditions, the dualism of the West versus the non-dualism we see historically in East and South Asia.
The Western tradition, heavily influenced by Stoicism and later by certain Christian doctrines, established a very strict dualism. Desire is classified as self-directed pleasure, driven by lust or appetite for personal satisfaction. Love, conversely, is classified as other-directed care, which requires controlling that selfish desire and subordinating it for the beloved's well-being.
It's the classic Stoic hero prioritizing duty over desire. Seneca, for example, warned against loving one's wife as if she were a mistress, arguing that constraint and control of desire were prerequisites for what he considered pure affection.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with Eastern and South Asian traditions where love and sex were often inseparable and non-dualistic. In ancient Japan, during the Heian period, love meant holism, the integration of the body and spirit, usually including sexual consummation. The complexity of love was understood as a cultural endeavor and a wholesome passion.
So it wasn't about suppressing the body for the spirit, but rather refining and integrating the body and spirit through mutual feeling and refinement.
Exactly. The key measure of a successful relationship for those Japanese lovers was the capacity to empathize with the partner's feelings. Furthermore, concepts like the Sanskrit term Sringara rasa define longings for sublime sexual partnerships that were reciprocal and excluded coercion. These traditions did not separate desire, as an appetite, from love, as selfless care and devotion.
In fact, some ancient South Asian court and temple practices made explicit ritualized connections between spiritual love and physical union.
They were central features of worship, saturated with this spiritualized love lust. They weren't fighting to prove love was a form of heroic self-denial. They were integrating desire into the concept of sublime connection.
We also have to acknowledge how Confucianism framed these relationships in Japan, which seems to have found a pragmatic way to accommodate same-sex relations without threatening the primary social order.
Confucianism's main stress was on maintaining the ancestral line and enforcing the 5 relations, father to son, husband to wife, and so on, as the stable foundation of civil society. In Japan, this structure did not view male-female relations as antithetical to male-male relations. Rather, it regarded male-male relations, codified by terms like danshoku, male eroticism, or wakashuju, the way of the youth, as quite complementary.
So male-male relations existed alongside the required male-female relationship for propagation.
Yes. Restrictions were only imposed when excesses threatened to disrupt the overall social harmony and the balance of classes, for example, when powerful figures patronized kabuki representations excessively. As long as the social plumbing was still working and the ancestral line was maintained, a wide variety of personal relationships could exist in the background, often protected by social convention.
This inherent fluidity in love concepts is mirrored in how societies have historically dealt with what we now call borderline genders. Which brings us to Section 3, where we examine cultures that accommodated people who broke the male-female binary.
The sociological evidence is overwhelming. Experiences of borderline genders were never a new phenomenon. They have always been present across cultures: Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan. Different societies historically found complex and sometimes contradictory ways to accept and accommodate people perceived as exceptional.
The term borderline gender is useful because it neutrally reflects this discovery without immediately applying modern Western identity politics to ancient or non-Western roles.
Absolutely. However, when dominant norms fail to make sense of these identities, the experience can become a linguistic limbo, where nonconforming people are seen as logical impossibilities, developmental failures, or simply pathological by the dominant culture.
Let's start with the Philippines and the Bakla, where the identity itself has undergone a rapid transformation over the last half-century.
Initially, the bakla was primarily a gender term associated with cross-dressing and effeminacy, particularly visible in the 1960s. By the 1970s, it became increasingly identified with homosexuality. It is vital to maintain the distinction. Bakla is fundamentally a gender term, referring to effeminate men, whereas gay refers to sexuality. Not all homosexuals in the Philippines are bakla.
And the Bakla carved out a specific, recognizable socioeconomic niche, often associated with specific service occupations.
Yes, they were, and they continue to be, commonly found working as manicurists, hairstylists, couturiers, and fashion designers. There's a widespread cultural expectation that the bakla will often fare better economically than the general male population, which became part of their accepted social script. But this visibility and relative success often comes with a troubling exchange rate, particularly in relationships.
Which is the paradoxical flow of money from the bakla to the masculine-presenting man, even in the context of male prostitution.
Precisely. In the case of informal transactions or relationships between baklas and seemingly straight males, the flow of money often goes from the bakla to the partner, the straight callboy or boyfriend, who typically insists on maintaining a hyper-masculine appearance.
If the bakla is ideologically scripted to suffer and pay, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the idea that these identities were truly accommodated? It sounds like a severe imposition of traditional gender roles onto a non-traditional dynamic.
It is a stark imposition. The sociological observation here is that the bakla is scripted to occupy the subservient role of a pseudo-woman, but unlike a woman, they must pay for the service of the masculine partner. It institutionalizes their marginalized status, even while they achieve economic success in other spheres. They are accommodated, but within a hierarchy that requires them to financially validate the masculinity of their partners.
Moving to Indonesia, we find examples where borderline gender isn't just accommodated or economically scripted, but is imbued with genuinely sacred or mystical purpose.
This is where we see the concept of metagender, exemplified by the Bisu, the Buji shamans of South Sulawesi. They are categorized as a combination of male and female genders, often described as men with women's souls, and their primary revered role is to bridge the realms of the gods and humans.
So their function is purely religious, bestowing blessings, performing complex ceremonies, acting as intermediaries.
And their feminine dress is wholly ritualistic, not merely transvestism for social visibility. Crucially, Their spiritual power is maintained through asceticism. They must perform the terrifying Magiri ritual, self-stabbing with sharp daggers, to prove spirit possession and invulnerability. And they must absolutely restrain their sexual instincts toward women.
Why this specific restraint toward women?
The Bugis believe that sexual intercourse with women can weaken or obliterate their spiritual powers and cut off their relationship with the deities. The non-conforming gender expression, the feminine appearance and avoidance of traditional male-female coupling, serves the practical function of preserving spiritual wisdom. That Bisu model shows us that gender nonconformity can actually be a prerequisite for sacred power, not a detriment.
That is a fascinating contrast to the Bakla model. We see other forms of non-conforming identity in Indonesia as well, such as the waria.
The waria, it's a portmanteau of wanita, woman, and priya, man. They represent a subjectivity that often belongs neither to traditional culture nor to full modernity. They face numerous stereotypes, often being labeled as impotent, passive, or cowardly, which are frequently untrue. In reality, they can be very brave and aggressive, even in their sexual relationships where they do not always play the passive role.
And you mentioned they sometimes display an internal misogyny, calling women raccoon or poison.
That misogyny stems from a deeply competitive social environment where women are viewed as competitors for male lovers. It's a complex, painful survival mechanism within their social niche. Despite facing significant ostracism, many waria are very devoted Muslims, and we even see a particular pesantren, a Quranic school opened near Yogyakarta, specifically to host and provide religious formation and working skills to waria people, suggesting grassroots accommodation despite broader societal stigma.
And finally, the Warok, who are wise people or elders, also engage in specific ascetic practices that influence their relationships, but for a different purpose than the Bisu.
The Warok, who possess mystical powers, Kanarangan and Kabatinan, must also refrain from human instincts to maintain their purity and wisdom. This includes fasting, avoiding drink, and most importantly, avoiding any contact with women. This requirement sometimes leads to homosexual practices as a prescribed way to preserve their wisdom and spiritual strength. It contrasts with modern gay identity, which derives merely from the desire for same-sex relationships. For the Warok, the act itself is instrumental to their sacred status.
Now let's turn back to Japan to see how its history of accommodation, which we discussed earlier, was violently shattered by the same westernization that introduced AI. Prior to the Meiji Restoration, there was significant tolerance.
There was, largely thanks to the influence of Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism. They generally maintained a tolerant respect for male-male relations, codified by terms like danshoku or wakashudu, the way of the youth. This acceptance was woven into the cultural and spiritual fabric.
I find the Buddhist metaphysical interpretation particularly interesting, where the act of love becomes a spiritual tool.
It provided a powerful spiritual justification for these bonds. The fading beauty of the young male acolyte, the wakashu, became an incentive for the older partner to reflect intensely on the impermanence of all things, a core Buddhist tenet, thus aiding spiritual awakening. Attraction between the two was often interpreted as the effect of a karmic bond established in a previous life. Desire was integrated into spiritual discipline.
That is a deeply philosophical way to rationalize desire, tying it directly to principles of impermanence, which is a far cry from the Western idea of passion as an impediment to spirituality.
However, this historical acceptance dissolved rapidly with modernization and the importation of Western sexology. Following the Meiji Restoration, society adopted the idea that sexual desire was part of the psychic personality, and certain inclinations labeled perverse, hentai seoku, were seen as symptoms of mental deviations or disorders. The government quickly outlawed practices previously associated with male prostitution.
That seems to be the crucial moment when the West exported not just technology, but also a framework for condemning certain behaviors as pathological.
It was a radical shift, and it resulted in the modern reality where the majority of Japanese society came to consider sexual minorities abnormal and suffering from psychological disorders like gender identity disorder. The terminology itself became pathological. We saw the emergence of terms like sodomia and homo, and later gay bougie imported during the American occupation, often used to describe men working in gay bars as entertainers.
And this modern stigma led directly to significant legal setbacks, notably the infamous Blue Boy trial, which had long-lasting consequences for transgender individuals.
The Blue Board trial in 1965 is a pivotal moment in the legal curtailment of gender self-determination. A physician was accused of removing the sexual organs of 3 men. The tribunal ruled that the doctor had violated the eugenic protection law, which prohibited surgical procedures resulting in sterilization. This ruling led to the suspension of sex reassignment surgeries across Japan until 1998.
Yet even with that legal restriction, transgender individuals found ways to persist, often leveraging their economic niches to seek changes abroad.
Absolutely. Those working in the sex industry, like the Nyuho or Nuhaf, invested their profits to gain access to hormonal treatments and surgical procedures outside of Japan. This led to the Nyuhafu category, literally meaning half man and half woman, gaining massive public attention in the 1980s, often through television and media.
That's a key link back to our focus area, the media. The term Nyuhafu became popularized through television and became a visible, recognized category for transsexual male artists taking on feminine roles, often mixing Japanese and Western tropes. The media created a recognizable, if often exploited, category for identity where the legal system had failed to provide one.
It is a remarkable testament to the persistence of identity against rigid legal obstacles. But the public visibility the media provided was a double-edged sword. It offered recognition while simultaneously reinforcing stereotypes of these individuals as existing primarily for entertainment or sexual service.
Now, we have to transition to Section 4, where we examine how these changing concepts of love and gender collide with the global forces of consumerism and social conflict, especially as modern relationships try to reconcile passion with duty.
Let's start with the commodification of romance. What happens when you combine the spiritualization of AI and the passionate disruption of koi with Madison Avenue advertising campaigns?
You get a new social script. This phenomenon began in the early 20th century, largely fueled by American promotion of romantic consumerism. Feelings of love became explicitly linked to the consumption of commodities and services travel, expensive dining, gifts.
This was a profound cultural shift away from the traditional non-commercial exchange of affection. Before this, expressions of love often involved personal, non-commercial gifts, a lock of hair, a handmade card, a highly personalized token.
But the modern script transformed traditional reticence into expensive gift-giving as a necessary public declaration of love.
Indeed, advertising widely broadcast this new script, associating what they called ego-expressive commodities, shampoo, perfume, cosmetics, jewelry, with the romantic experience. Consumption became synonymous with romantic engagement, setting up often unrealistic expectations that only external purchases could validate internal feelings.
And this modern romantic ideal immediately runs into conflict with deep-seated traditional structures, especially concerning the institution of marriage.
The core conflict is the philosophical timing of love. Modern Western culture generally views love as a prerequisite for marriage, the spontaneous, irrational attraction that justifies the union. However, many Eastern and traditional cultures view love as a consequence of marriage, something that evolves within the relationship through shared duty, stability, and routine.
That distinction changes everything about the expectations going in. If love is a consequence, then stability and family approval are the primary prerequisites, not passion.
We see this tension played out vividly in countries like Morocco. While modern young people are increasingly attracted to the love match, they pursue it in a way that involves compromise, making the match socially acceptable to gain parental approval. The young women in particular are socialized to behave responsibly, prioritizing the practical importance of a stable marriage over merely following passionate feelings. The desire for koi must be rationalized into the framework of A.
This tension led to a specific cultural breakdown in Japanese marriages post-1960s, where the passion was totally divorced from the stable companionate relationship, resulting in profound alienation.
This was the confluence of several forces. The nurtured ethos of sexual purity, which was the new AI, the husband's prolonged working hours or the corporate duty, and the heavy burden of child-rearing and domestic work placed solely on the wives. The marriage became a co-parenting duty, often freed from sex entirely, particularly after the necessary reproduction had occurred.
So, if that passion, that koi, was systematically removed from the marital relationship, where did that suppressed sexual and emotional desire go?
The wives' sexual desires were often suppressed or displaced, sometimes channeled into fantasy, like soap operas, or displaced onto children. The husband's sexuality was aggressively redirected outside the home. This was evidenced dramatically by the rise of overseas sex tours to places like South Korea and Thailand, starting in the late 1960s. This was the commercialization of displaced koi.
And that separation then fed into the Paradise Lost phenomenon of the 1990s, where extramarital affairs became culturally acceptable, even aspirational.
That novel, Schizoreklen, became a cultural touchstone. It captivated the imagination precisely because it presented the possibility of an intimate, extramarital romance, a deeply emotional, physical, and expensive affair as a romantic ideal. It normalized the burgeoning desire for furin or adulterous affairs, not just with prostitutes, but with well-educated, attractive, mature partners.
It sounds like the passionate, chaotic desire, the koi that had been culturally removed from the marital structure, re-emerged in the realm of external fantasy and reality, sanctioned by the media narrative.
Precisely. The novel essentially argued that true, integrated love, that amor paixão conflation, could only be found outside the stifling duty of the modern Japanese marriage. It redefined the locus of genuine feeling.
We see a similar, though perhaps less dramatic, ambivalence in modern China, where young people have to reconcile deep romantic feelings with the pragmatic, instrumental values necessary for family stability.
The challenge for modern Chinese youth is bridging that huge cultural gap. Romantic involvement is regarded as truly genuine and profoundly moving, a deep personal experience, but it constantly clashes with the instrumental and pragmatic values necessary for family and economic stability. When discussing an ideal mate, they often resort to pragmatic values, financial stability, job security, even if their lived experience of courtship is intensely emotional. This reconciliation of competing values remains a continuous, stressful challenge for young adults.
Finally, we have to look at the current political and social struggles for recognition faced by sexual minorities, which are, in a way, mirroring the push and pull we saw between the historical accommodation pre-Meiji and the modern condemnation post-Meiji.
In Taiwan, the political push for multiculturalism and human rights has opened the social arena for minority groups. This has involved significant political struggles, such as the proposed amendment to the Civil Code for same-sex marriage and the fierce controversy over Ministry of Education textbooks aimed at promoting acceptance.
I recall the Ministry of Education controversy being highly volatile, showing the deep cultural rift that political progress creates.
It was incredibly divisive. Textbooks intended to promote respect and acceptance were censored and recalled after conservative protests. One particular teaching manual on homosexuality faced immense backlash. It shows that while political will for recognition exists, conservative social norms remain incredibly powerful and resistant to change. The struggle is ongoing, aimed at achieving full legal and social equality, which is expected to take many years.
And in Japan, where we began this journey, the modern stigma, that idea that sexual minorities suffer from psychological disorders, translates directly into alarming rates of violence and a profound lack of systemic support.
The data is deeply concerning. Teenagers, sex industry workers, and victims of partner or family violence are disproportionately exposed to physical, psychological, verbal, and sexual violence. This highlights the practical failures of a society that continues to label these identities as abnormal rather than accommodated.
What are the primary structural needs identified to alleviate this suffering? What must happen on a societal level?
The needs fall into three clear categories. First, social institutions must be educated. Doctors, police, lawyers, employers, they need specialized training to handle these issues sensitively and without prejudice. Second, there's a clear and urgent need for laws against violence and hatred to provide baseline protection for sexual minorities. And third, and perhaps most vitally, there is a chronic lack of essential services, like shelters for gay and transgender victims of violence, which are currently unavailable or woefully insufficient. The failure to integrate sexual minorities results in unbearable violence and rights violations and represents a tragic loss of human potential shared by those who are marginalized. Our deep dive has shown that the way a culture defines and names love, whether through the chaotic passion of koi versus the pure stability of a, or the dangerous desire of ilhab versus the duty of ralia, fundamentally determines what types of relationships are deemed intelligible, legitimate, and safe. The linguistic framework dictates the social consequences, creating scripts for acceptance, condemnation, or even sacred purpose.
And the beauty of looking at all these diverse structures, from the spiritual roles of the Indonesian bisu to the consumer scripts that define American dating, is that they all spring from the same root, a universal human longing. Whether that longing is for the passionate chaos of koi or the enduring safety of ralia, societies structure life either to accommodate those powerful, often unruly desires or to suppress them entirely. The result is that love in all its forms is constantly being negotiated between the individual human heart and the relentless demands of the collective world.